Section 24 of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Curtis. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842. By Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H. P. Paul. The Metal Pig. In the city of Florence, not far from the Piazza del Grandusa, runs a little street called Porta Rossa. In this street, just in front of the market-place where vegetables are sold, stands a pig made of brass and curiously formed. The bright colour has been changed by age to dark green, but clear fresh water pours from the snout, which shines as if it had been polished, and so indeed it has, for hundreds of poor people and children seize it in their hands as they place their mouths close to the mouth of the animal to drink. It is quite a picture to see a half-naked boy clasping the well-formed creature by the head as he presses his rosy lips against its jaws. Every one who visits Florence can very quickly find the place. He has only to ask the first beggar he meets for the metal pig, and he will be told where it is. It was late on a winter evening. The mountains were covered with snow, but the moon shone brightly, and moonlight in Italy is like a dull winter's day in the north. Indeed, it is better, for clear air seems to raise us above the earth, while in the north a cold, grey, leaden sky appears to press us down to earth, even as the cold, damp earth shall one day press on us in the grave. In the garden of the Grand Duke's palace, under the roof of one of the wings, where 1,000 roses bloom in water, a little ragged boy had been sitting the whole day long, a boy who might serve as a type of Italy, lovely and smiling, and yet still suffering. He was hungry and thirsty, yet no one gave him anything. And when it became dark, and they were about to close the gardens, the porter turned him out. He stood a long time, musing on the bridge which crosses the Arno, and looking at the glittering stars reflected in the water which flowed between him and the elegant marble bridge della Trinita. He then walked away towards the metal pig, half knelt down, clasped it with his arms, and then put his mouth to the shining snout and drank deep draughts of the fresh water. Close by lay a few salad leaves and 2 chestnuts, which were to serve for his supper. No one was in the street but himself. It belonged only to him, so he boldly seated himself on the pig's back, leaned forward so that his curly head could rest on the head of the animal, and before he was aware, he fell asleep. It was midnight. The metal pig raised himself gently, and the boy heard him say quite distinctly, "Hold tight, little boy, for I am going to run." And away he started for a most wonderful ride. First they arrived at the Piazza del Grandusa, and the metal horse which bears the Duke's statues neighed aloud. The painted coat of arms on the old council house shone like transparent pictures, and Michelangelo's David tossed his sling. It was as if everything had life. The metallic groups of figures, among which were Perseus and the Rape of the Sabines, looked like living persons, and cries of terror sounded from them all across the noble square. By the Palazzo degli Uffizi, in the arcade where the nobility assembled for the carnival, the metal pig stopped. "Hold fast," said the animal. "Hold fast, for I am going upstairs." The little boy said not a word. He was half pleased and half afraid. They entered a long gallery, where the boy had been before. The walls were resplendent with paintings. Here stood statues and busts, all in a clear light as if it were day. But the grandest appeared when the door of a side room opened. The little boy could remember what beautiful things he had seen there, but tonight everything shone in its brightest colours. Here stood the figure of a beautiful woman, as beautifully sculptured as possible by one of the great masters. Her graceful limbs appeared to move, dolphins sprang at her feet, and immortality shone from her eyes. The world called her the Venus de Medici. By her side were statues in which the spirit of life breathed in stone, figures of men, one of whom whetted his sword and was named the Grinder. Wrestling gladiators formed another group. The sword had been sharpened for them, and they strove for the goddess of beauty. The boy was dazzled by so much glitter, for the walls were gleaming with bright colours, all appeared living reality. As they passed from hall to hall, beauty everywhere shone itself, and as the metal pig went step by step from one picture to the other, the little boy could see it all plainly. One glory eclipsed another, yet there was one picture that fixed itself on the little boy's memory, more especially because of the happy children it represented, for these the little boy had seen in daylight. Many pass this picture by with indifference, and yet it contains a treasure of poetic feeling. It represents Christ descending into Hades. They are not the lost whom the spectator sees, but the heathen of olden times. The Florentine Agnolo Bronzino painted this picture. Most beautiful is the expression on the face of the two children, who appear to have full confidence that they shall reach heaven at last. They are embracing each other, and one little one stretches out his hand towards another, who stand below him, and points to himself as if he were saying, "I am going to heaven." The older people stand as if uncertain, yet hopeful, and they bow in humble adoration to the Lord Jesus. On this picture the boy's eyes rested longer than on any other. The metal pig stood still before it. A low sigh was heard. Did it come from the picture or from the animal? The boy raised his hands towards the smiling children, and then the pig ran off with him through the open vestibule. thank you, you beautiful animal," said the little boy, caressing the metal pig as it ran down the steps. "Thanks to yourself also," replied the metal pig. "I have helped you, and you have helped me, for it is only when I have an innocent child on my back that I receive the power to run. Yes, as you see, I can even venture under the rays of the lamp, in front of the picture of the Madonna, but I may not enter the church. Still from without, and while you are upon my back, I may look in through the open door. Do not go down yet, for if you do, then I shall be lifeless, as you have seen me in the Porta Rosa." "I will stay with you, my dear creature," said the little boy. So then they went on at a rapid pace through the streets of Florence, till they came to the square before the church of Santa Croce. The folding doors flew open, and light streamed from the altar through the church into the deserted square. A wonderful blaze of light streamed from one of the monuments in the left side aisle, and 1,000 moving stars seemed to form a glory round it. Even the coat of arms on the tombstone shone, and a red ladder on a blue field gleamed like fire. It was the grave of Galileo. The monument is unadorned, but the red ladder is an emblem of art, signifying that the way to glory leads up a shining ladder, on which the prophets of mind rise to heaven, like Elias of old. In the right aisle of the church, every statue on the richly carved sarcophagi seemed endowed with life. Here stood Michelangelo, there Dante, with the laurel wreath round his brow, Alfieri and Machiavelli, for here, side by side, rest the great men, the pride of Italy. Opposite to the grave of Galileo is the tomb of Michelangelo. His bust stands upon it, with 3 figures representing sculpture, painting, and architecture. Close by is a monument to Dante, whose body is buried in a Ravenna. On this monument, Italy is represented, pointing to the colossal statue of Dante, while poetry weeps over his loss. A few steps further is Alfieri's monument, which is adorned with laurel, the lyre, and dramatic masks. Italy weeps over the grave. Machiavelli is the last in the list of these celebrated men. The church itself is very beautiful, even more beautiful than the marble cathedral at Florence, though not so large. It seemed as if the carved vestments stirred, and as if the marble figures they covered raised their heads higher, to gaze upon the brightly coloured glowing altar where the white-robed boys swung the golden censers, amid music and song, while the strong fragrance of incense filled the church and streamed forth into the square. The boy stretched forth his hands towards the light, and at the same moment the metal pig started again, so rapidly that he was obliged to cling tightly to him. The wind whistled in his ears. He heard the church door creak on its hinges as it closed, and it seemed to him as if he had lost his senses. Then a cold shudder passed over him, and he awoke. It was morning. The metal pig stood in its old place on the Porta Rosa, and the boy found he had slipped nearly off its back. Fear and trembling came upon him as he thought of his mother. She had sent him out the day before to get some money. He had not done so, and now he was hungry and thirsty. Once more he clasped the neck of his metal horse, kissed its nose, and nodded farewell to it. Then he wandered away into one of the narrowest streets, where there was scarcely room for a loaded donkey to pass. A great iron-bound door stood ajar, and he passed through, and climbed up a brick staircase with dirty walls and a rope for a balustrade, till he came to an open gallery hung with rags. From here a flight of steps led down to a court, where from a well water was drawn up by iron rollers to the different stories of the house, and where the water buckets hung side by side. Sometimes the roller and the bucket danced in the air, splashing the water all over the court. Another broken-down staircase led from the gallery, and 2 Russian sailors running down it almost upset the poor boy. They were coming from their nightly carousal. A woman, not very young, with an unpleasant face and a quantity of black hair, followed them. "What have you brought home?" she asked when she saw the boy. "Don't be angry," he pleaded. "I received nothing. I have nothing at all." And he seized his mother's dress and would have kissed it. Then they went into the little room. I need not describe it, but only say that there stood in it an earthen pot with handles made for holding fire, which in Italy is called a marito. This pot she took in her lap, warmed her fingers, and pushed the boy with her elbow. "Certainly you must have some money." The boy began to cry, and then she struck him with her foot till he cried out louder. "Will you be quiet, or I'll break your screaming head?" And she swung about the fire pot which she held in her hand, while the boy crouched to the earth and screamed. Then a neighbor came in, and she also had a marito under her arm. "Felicita," she said, "what are you doing to the child?" "The child is mine," she answered. "I can murder him if I like, and you too, Gianni." And then she swung about the fire pot. The other woman lifted up hers to defend herself, and the 2 pots clashed together so violently that they were dashed to pieces, and fire and ashes flew about the room. The poor child ran till he was quite out of breath. At last he stopped at the church, the doors of which were open to him the night before, and went in. Here everything was bright, and the boy knelt down by the first tomb on his right, the grave of Michelangelo, and sobbed as if his heart would break. People came and went. Mass was performed, but no one noticed the boy, excepting an elderly citizen, who stood still and looked at him for a moment, and then went away like the rest. Hunger and thirst overpowered the child, and he became quite faint and ill. At last he crept into a corner behind the marble monuments and went to sleep. Towards evening he was awakened by a pull at his sleeve. He started up, and the same old citizen stood before him. "Are you ill? Where do you live? Have you been here all day?" were some of the questions asked by the old man. After hearing his answers, the old man took him home to a small house close by, in a back street. They entered a glove-maker's shop, where a woman sat sewing busily. A little white poodle, so closely shaven that his pink skin could plainly be seen, frisked about the room and gambolled upon the boy. "Innocent souls are soon intimate," said the woman as she caressed both the boy and the dog. "These good people gave their child food and drink, and said he should stay with them all night, and that the next day the old man, who was called Giuseppe, would go and speak to his mother. A little homely bed was prepared for him, but to him who had so often slept on the hard stones it was a royal couch, and he slept sweetly and dreamed of the splendid pictures and of the metal pig. Giuseppe went out the next morning, and the poor child was not glad to see him go, for he knew that the old man was gone to his mother, and that perhaps he would have to go back. He wept at the thought, and then he played with the little lively dog and kissed it, while the old woman looked kindly at him to encourage him. And what news did Giuseppe bring back? At first the boy could not hear, for he talked a great deal to his wife, and she nodded and stroked the boy's cheek. Then she said, "He is a good lad. He shall stay with us. He may become a clever glove-maker like you. Look what delicate fingers he has got. Madonna intended him for a glove-maker." So the boy stayed with them, and the woman herself taught him to sew, and he ate well and slept well, and became very merry. But at last he began to tease Bellissima, as the little dog was called. This made the woman angry, and she scolded him and threatened him, which made him very unhappy. And he went and sat in his own room full of sad thoughts. The chamber looked upon the street, in which hung skins to dry, and there were thick iron bars across his window. That night he lay awake thinking of the metal pig. Indeed, it was always in his thoughts. Suddenly he fancied he heard feet outside going a pit-a-pat. He sprung out of bed and went to the window. Could it be the metal pig? But there was nothing to be seen. Whatever he had heard had passed already. Next morning their neighbour the artist passed by, carrying a paint-box and a large roll of canvas. "Help the gentleman to carry his box of colours," said the woman to the boy, and he obeyed instantly, took the box, and followed the painter. They walked on till they reached the picture gallery, and mounted the same staircase up which he had ridden that night on the metal pig. He remembered all the statues and pictures, the beautiful marble Venus, and again he looked at the Madonna with the Saviour and St. John. They stopped before the picture by Bronzino, in which Christ is represented as standing in the lower world, with the children smiling before him in the sweet expectation of entering heaven, and the poor boy smiled too, for here was his heaven. "You may go home now," said the painter, while the boy stood watching him till he had set up his easel. "May I see you paint?" asked the boy. "May I see you put the picture on this white canvas?" "I am not going to paint yet," replied the artist. Then he brought out a piece of chalk. His hand moved quickly, and his eye measured the great picture, and though nothing appeared but a faint line, the figure of the Saviour was as clearly visible as in the coloured picture. "Why don't you go?" said the painter. Then the boy wandered home silently, and seated himself on the table, and learned to sew gloves. But all day long his thoughts were in the picture gallery, and so he prickled his fingers and was awkward. But he did not tease Bellissima. When evening came and the house door stood open, he slipped out. It was a bright, beautiful starlight evening, but rather cold. Away he went through the already deserted streets, and soon came to the metal pig. He stooped down and kissed its shining nose, and then seated himself on its back. "You happy creature," he said, "how I have longed for you! We must take a ride tonight." But the metal pig lay motionless, while the fresh steam gushed forth from its mouth. The little boy still sat astride on its back, when he felt something pulling at its clothes. He looked down, and there was Bellissima, little smooth-shaven Bellissima, barking as if she would have said, "Here I am too! Why are you sitting there?" A fiery dragon could not have frightened the little boy so much as did the little dog in this place. "Bellissima in the street, and not dressed," as the old lady called it. "What would be the end of this?" The dog never went out in winter, unless she was attired in a little lambskin coat which had been made for her. It was fastened round the little dog's neck and body with red ribbons, and was decorated with rosettes and little bells. The dog looked almost like a little kid when she was allowed to go out in winter, and trot after her mistress. And now here she was in the cold, and not dressed. Oh, how would it all end? All his fancies were quickly put to flight. Yet he kissed the metal pig once more, and then took Bellissima in his arms. The poor little thing trembled so with cold that the boy ran homeward as fast as he could. "What are you running away with there?" asked two of the police whom he met, and at whom the dog barked. "Where have you stolen that pretty dog?" they asked, and they took it away from him. "Oh, I have not stolen it. Do give it to me back again," cried the boy despairingly. "If you have not stolen it, you may stay at home that they can send to the watch-house for the dog." Then they told him where the watch-house was, and went away with Bellissima. Here was a dreadful trouble. The boy did not know whether he had better jump into the Arno, or go home and confess everything. They would certainly kill him, he thought. "Well, I will gladly be killed," he reasoned, "for then I shall die and go to heaven." And so he went home, almost hoping for death. The door was locked, and he could not reach the knocker. No one was in the street, so he took up a stone, and with it made a tremendous noise at the door. "Who is there?" asked someone from within. "It is I," said he. "Bellissima is gone. Open the door, and then kill me." Then indeed there was a great panic. Madame was so very fond of Bellissima. She immediately looked at the wall where the dog's dress usually hung, and there was the little lambskin. "Bellissima in the watch-house!" she cried. "You bad boy, how did you entice her out? Poor little delicate thing, with those rough policemen, and she'll be frozen with cold." Giuseppe went off at once, while his wife lamented, and the boy wept. Several of the neighbours came in, and amongst them the painter. He took the boy between his knees and questioned him, and in broken sentences he soon heard the whole story, and also about the metal pig and the wonderful ride to the picture gallery, which was certainly rather incomprehensible. The painter, however, consoled the little fellow, and tried to soften the lady's anger, but she would not be pacified till her husband returned with Bellissima, who had been with the police. Then there was a great rejoicing, and the painter caressed the boy, and gave him a number of pictures. Oh, what beautiful pictures these were! Figures with funny heads, and above all, the metal pig was there too. Oh, nothing could be more delightful. By means of a few strokes it was made to appear on the paper, and even the house that stood behind it had been sketched in. Oh, if he could only draw and paint! He who could do this could conjure all the world before him. The first leisure moment during the next day, the boy got a pencil, and on the back of one of the other drawings he attempted to copy the drawing of the metal pig. And he succeeded. Certainly it was rather crooked, rather up and down, one leg thick and another thin. Still, it was like the copy, and he was overjoyed at what he had done. The pencil would not go quite as it ought. He had found that out, for the next day he tried again. A second pig was drawn by the side of the first, and this looked 100 times better, and the third attempt was so good that everybody might know what it was meant to represent. And now the glove-making went on, but slowly. The orders given by the shops in the town were not finished quickly, for the metal pig had taught the boy that all objects may be drawn upon paper, and Florence is a picture book in itself for anyone who chooses to turn over its pages. On the Piazza del Trinita stands a slender pillar, and upon it is the Goddess of Justice, blindfolded with her scales in her hand. She was soon represented on paper, and it was the glove-maker's boy who placed her there. His collection of pictures increased, but as yet they were only copies of lifeless objects, when, one day, Bellissima came gambolling before him. "Stand still," cried he, "and I will draw you beautifully to put among my collection." But Bellissima would not stand still, so she must be bound fast in one position. He tied her head and tail, but she barked and jumped, and so pulled and tightened the string that she was nearly strangled, and just then her mistress walked in. "You wicked boy! The poor little creature!" was all she could utter. She pushed the boy from her, thrust him away with her foot, called him a most ungrateful, good-for-nothing, wicked boy, and forbade him to enter the house again. Then she wept and kissed her little half-strangled Bellissima. At this moment the painter entered the room. In the year 1834 there was an exhibition in the Academy of Arts at Florence. Two pictures placed side by side attracted a large number of the spectators. The smaller of the two represented a little boy sitting at a table, drawing. Before him was a little white poodle, curiously shaven, but as the animal would not stand still, it had been fastened with a string to its head and tail to keep it in one position. The truthfulness and life in this picture interested everyone. The painter was said to be a young Florentine who had been found in the streets when a child by an old glove-maker who had brought him up. The boy had taught himself to draw. It was also said that a young artist, now famous, had discovered talent in the child, just as he was about to be sent away for having tied up Madame's favourite little dog and using it as a model. The glove-maker's boy had also become a great painter, as the picture proved, but the larger picture by its side was still greater proof of his talent. It represented a handsome boy, clothed in rags, lying asleep, and leaning against a metal pig in the street of the Porta Rossa. All the spectators knew the spot well. The child's arms were round the neck of the pig, and he was in a deep sleep. The lamp before the picture of the Madonna threw a strong, effective light on the pale, delicate face of the child. It was a beautiful picture. A large gilt frame surrounded it, and on one corner of the frame a laurel wreath had been hung, but a black band twined unseen amongst the green leaves, and a streamer of crape hung down from it, for within the last few days the young artist had died. End of The Metal Pig. Recording by James Curtis.
Section 25 of Hans Christian Andersen's Fairy Tales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairy Tales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen, translated by H.P. Paul. The Shepherd's Story of the Bond of Friendship, by Hans Christian Andersen, 1842. The little dwelling in which we lived was of clay, but the doorposts were columns of fluted marble found near the spot on which it stood. The roof sloped nearly to the ground. It was at this time dark brown and ugly, but had originally been formed of blooming olive and laurel branches brought from beyond the mountains. The house was situated in a narrow gorge whose rocky walls rose to a perpendicular height, naked and black, while round their summits clouds often hung, looking like white living figures. Not a singing bird was ever heard there, neither did men dance to the sound of the pipe. The spot was one sacred to olden times. Even its name recalled a memory of the days when it was called Delphi. Then the summits of the dark sacred mountains were covered with snow, and the highest, Mount Parnassus, glowed longest in the red evening light. The brook which rolled from it near our house was also sacred. How well I can remember every spot in that deep sacred solitude. A fire had been kindled in the midst of the hut, and while the hot ashes lay there red and glowing, the bread was baked in them. At times the snow would be piled so high around our hut as to almost hide it, and then my mother appeared most cheerful. She would hold my head between her hands and sing the songs she never sang at other times, for the Turks, our masters, would not allow it. She sang, "On the summit of Mount Olympus, in a forest of dwarf firs, lay an old stag. His eyes were heavy with tears and glittering with colors like dewdrops. And there came by a roebuck, and said, 'What aileth thee, that thou weepest blue and red tears?' And the stag answered, 'The Turk has come to our city. He has wild dogs for the chase, a goodly pack. I will drive them away across the islands, cried the young roebuck. I will drive them away across the islands into the deep sea. But before evening the roebuck was slain, and before night the hunted stag was dead. And when my mother sang thus, her eyes would become moist, and on the long eyelashes were tears, but she concealed them and watched the black bread baking in the ashes. And then I would clench my fist and cry, "We will kill these Turks." But she repeated the words of the song, "I will drive them across the islands to the deep sea." But before evening came the roebuck was slain, and before night the hunted stag was dead. We had been lonely in our hut for several days and nights when my father came home. I knew he would bring me some shells from the Gulf of Lepanto, or perhaps a knife with a shining blade. This time he brought under his sheepskin cloak a little child, a little half-naked girl. She was wrapped in a fur, but when this was taken off and she lay in my mother's lap, 3 silver coins were found fastened in her dark hair. They were all her possessions. My father told us that the child's parents had been killed by the Turks, and he talked so much about them that I dreamed of Turks all night. He himself had been wounded, and my mother bound up his arm. It was a deep wound, and the thick sheepskin cloak was stiff with congealed blood. The little maiden was to be my sister. How pretty and bright she looked! Even my mother's eyes were not more gentle than hers. Anastasia, as she was called, was to be my sister, because her father had been united to mine by an old custom which we still follow. They had sworn brotherhood in their youth, and the most beautiful and virtuous maiden in the neighborhood was chosen to perform the act of consecration upon this bond of friendship. So now this little girl was my sister. She sat in my lap, and I brought her flowers and feathers from the birds of the mountain. We drank together of the waters of Parnassus, and dwelt for many years beneath the laurel roof of the hut, while winter after winter my mother sang her song of the stag who shed red tears. But as yet I did not understand that the sorrows of my own countrymen were mirrored in those tears. One day there came to our hut Franks, men from a far country, whose dress was different to ours. They had tents and beds with them, carried by horses, and they were accompanied by more than 20 Turks, all armed with swords and muskets. These Franks were friends of the Pasha, and had letters from him commanding an escort for them. They only came to see our mountain, to ascend Parnassus amid the snow and clouds, and to look at the strange black rocks which raised their steep sides near our hut. They could not find room in the hut, nor endure the smoke that rolled along the ceiling till it found its way out at the low door. So they pitched their tents on a small space outside our dwelling. Roasted lambs and birds were brought forth, and strong sweet wine, of which the Turks are forbidden to partake. When they departed, I accompanied them for some distance, carrying my little sister Anastasia, wrapped in a goatskin, on my back. One of the Frankish gentlemen made me stand in front of a rock, and drew us both as we stood there, so that we looked like one creature. I did not think of it then, but Anastasia and I really were one. She was always sitting on my lap, or riding in the goatskin on my back, and in my dreams she always appeared to me. 2 nights after this, other men armed with knives and muskets came into our tent. They were Albanians, brave men, my mother told me. They only stayed a short time. My sister Anastasia sat on the knee of one of them, and when they were gone she had not 3 but 2 silver coins in her hair. One had disappeared. They wrapped tobacco in strips of paper and smoked it, and I remember they were uncertain as to the road they ought to take. But they were obliged to go at last, and my father went with them. Soon after we heard the sound of firing. The noise continued, and presently soldiers rushed into our hut and took my mother and myself and Anastasia prisoners. They declared that we had entertained robbers, and that my father had acted as their guide, and therefore we must now go with them. The corpses of the robbers and my father's corpse were brought into the hut. I saw my poor dead father, and cried till I fell asleep. When I awoke, I found myself in a prison, but the room was not worse than our own in the hut. They gave me onions and musty wine from a tarred cask, but we were not accustomed to much better fare at home. How long we were kept in prison I do not know, but many days and nights passed by. We were set free about Easter time. I carried Anastasia on my back, and we walked very slowly, for my mother was very weak, and it is a long way to the sea, to the Gulf of Lepanto. On our arrival we entered a church in which there were beautiful pictures in golden frames. They were pictures of angels, fair and bright, and yet our little Anastasia looked equally beautiful, as it seemed to me, and in the centre of the floor stood a coffin filled with roses. My mother told me it was the Lord Jesus Christ who was represented by these roses. Then the priest announced, "Christ is risen," and all the people greeted each other. Each one carried a burning taper in his hand, and one was given to me as well as to little Anastasia. The music sounded, and the people left the church hand in hand with joy and gladness. Outside the women were roasting the Paschal lamb. We were invited to partake, and as I sat by the fire, a boy older than myself put his arms round my neck and kissed me, and said, "Christ is risen." And thus it was that for the first time I met Aptanides. My mother could make fishermen's nets, for which there was a great demand here in the bay, and we lived a long time by the side of the sea, the beautiful sea, that had a taste like tears, and in its colours reminded me of the stag that wept red tears, for sometimes its waters were red, and sometimes green or blue. Aptanides knew how to manage our boat, and I often sat in it with my little Anastasia, while it glided on through the water, swift as a bird flying through the air. Then when the sun set, how beautifully deeply blue would be the tint on the mountains, one rising above the other in the far distance, and the summit of Mount Parnassus rising above them all like a glorious crown. Its top glittered in the evening rays like molten gold, and it seemed as if the light came from within it, for long after the sun had sunk beneath the horizon, the mountain top would glow in the clear blue sky. The white aquatic birds skimmed the surface of the water in their flight, and all was calm and still as amid the black rocks at Delphi. I lay on my back in the boat. Anastasia leaned against me, while the stars above us glittered more brightly than the lamps in our church. They were the same stars, and in the same position over me as when I used to sit in front of our hut at Delphi, and I had almost begun to fancy I was still there, when suddenly there was a splash in the water. Anastasia had fallen in, but in a moment Aptanides had sprung in after her, and was now holding her up to me. We dried her clothes as well as we were able, and remained on the water till they were dry, for we did not wish it to be known what a fright we had had, nor the danger which our little adopted sister had incurred, in whose life Aptanides had now a part. The summer came, and the burning heat of the sun tinted the leaves of the trees with lines of gold. I thought of our cool mountain home and the fresh water that flowed near it. My mother, too, longed for it, and one evening we wandered towards home. How peaceful and silent it was as we walked on through the thick wild thyme, still fragrant, though the sun had scorched the leaves. Not a single herdsman did we meet. Not a solitary hut did we pass. Everything appeared lonely and deserted. Only a shooting star showed that in the heavens there was yet life. I know not whether the clear blue atmosphere gleamed with its own light, or if the radiance came from the stars, but we could distinguish quite plainly the outline of the mountains. My mother lighted a fire and roasted some roots she had brought with her, and I and my little sister slept among the bushes without fear of the ugly Shmedradgi. According to suspicion among the Greeks, this is a monster produced from the unopened entrails of slaughtered sheep, which have been thrown away in the fields, from whose throat issues fire, or the wolf and the jackal, for my mother sat by us, and I considered her presence sufficient protection. We reached our old home, but the cottage was in ruins, and we had to build a new one. With the aid of some neighbours, chiefly women, the walls were in a few days erected, and very soon covered with a roof of olive branches. My mother obtained a living by making bottle cases of bark and skins, and I kept the sheep belonging to the priests, who were sometimes peasants. A peasant who can read is often made a priest. He is addressed as "Most Holy Sir," and the other peasants kiss the ground on which he has stepped. While I had for my playfellows Anastasia and the turtles. Once our beloved Aptanides paid us a visit. He said that he had been longing to see us so much, and he remained with us 2 whole happy days. A month afterward he came again to wish us good-bye, and brought with him a large fish for my mother. He told us he was going in a ship to Corfu and Patras, and he could relate a great many stories, not only about fishermen who lived near the Gulf of Lepanto, but also of kings and heroes who had once possessed Greece, just as the Turks possess it now. I have seen a bud on a rose bush gradually, in the course of a few weeks, unfold its leaves till it became a rose in all its beauty, and before I was aware of it, I beheld it blooming in rosy loveliness. The same thing had happened to Anastasia. Unnoticed by me, she had gradually become a beautiful maiden, and I was now also a stout, strong youth. The wolf-skins that covered the bed in which my mother and Anastasia slept had been taken from wolves which I had myself shot. Years had gone by, when one evening Aptanides came in. He had grown tall and slender as a reed, with strong limbs and a dark brown skin. He kissed us all, and had so much to tell of what he had seen of the great ocean, of the fortifications at Malta, and of the marvellous sepulchres of Egypt, that I looked up to him with a kind of veneration. His stories were as strange as the legends of the priests of olden times. "How much you know!" I exclaimed, "and what wonders you can relate!" "I think what you once told me the finest of all," he replied. "You told me of a thing that has never been out of my thoughts, of the good old custom of the bond of friendship, a custom I should like to follow. Brother, let you and I go to church, as your father and Anastasia's father once did. Your sister Anastasia is the most beautiful and most innocent of maidens, and she shall consecrate the deed. No people have such grand old customs as we Greeks." Anastasia blushed like a young rose, and my mother kissed Aptanides. At about 2 miles from our cottage, where the earth on the hill is sheltered by a few scattered trees, stood the little church, with a silver lamp hanging before the altar. I put on my best clothes, and the white tunic fell in graceful folds over my hips. The red jacket fitted tight and close. The tassel on my fez cap was of silver, and in my girdle glittered a knife and my pistols. Aptanides was clad in the blue dress worn by the Greek sailors. On his breast hung a silver medal with the figure of the Virgin Mary, and his scarf was as costly as those worn by rich lords. Every one could see that we were about to perform a solemn ceremony. When we entered the little unpretending church, the evening sunlight streamed through the open door on the burning lamp, and glittered on the golden picture frames. We knelt down together on the altar steps, and Anastasia drew near and stood beside us. A long white garment fell in graceful folds over her delicate form, and on her white neck and bosom hung a chain entwined with old and new coins, forming a kind of collar. Her black hair was fastened into a knot, and confined by a headdress formed of gold and silver coins which had been found in an ancient temple. No Greek girl had more beautiful ornaments than these. Her countenance glowed, and her eyes were like 2 stars. We all 3 offered a silent prayer, and then she said to us, "Will you be friends in life and in death?" "Yes," we replied. will you each remember to say, whatever may happen, my brother is a part of myself, his secret is my secret, my happiness is his, self-sacrifice, patience, everything belongs to me as they do to him? And again we answered, yes. Then she joined our hands and kissed us on the forehead, and we again prayed silently. After this a priest came through a door near the altar and blessed us all three. Then a song was sung by other holy men behind the altar screen, and the bond of eternal friendship was confirmed. When we arose, I saw my mother standing by the church door, weeping. How cheerful everything seemed now in our little cottage by the Delphian Springs. On the evening before his departure, Aptanides sat thoughtfully beside me on the slopes of the mountain. His arm was flung around me, and mine was round his neck. We spoke of the sorrows of Greece, and of the men of the country who could be trusted. Every thought of our souls lay clear before us. Presently I seized his hand. "Aptanides," I exclaimed, "there is one thing still that you must know, one thing that till now has been a secret between myself and heaven. My whole soul is filled with a love stronger than the love I bear to my mother and to thee." "And whom do you love?" asked Aptanides, and his face and neck grew red as fire. "I love Anastasia," I replied. Then his hand trembled in mine, and he became pale as a corpse. I saw it, I understood the cause, and I believe my hand trembled too. I bent towards him, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "I have never spoken of this to her, and perhaps she does not love me. Brother, think of this. I have seen her daily. She has grown up beside me and has become a part of my soul." "And she shall be thine," he exclaimed. "Thine. I may not wrong thee, nor will I do so. I also love her. But tomorrow I depart. In a year we will see each other again. But then you will be married. Shall it not be so? I have a little gold of my own. It shall be yours. You must and shall take it." We wandered silently homeward across the mountains. It was late in the evening when we reached my mother's door. Anastasia held the lamp as we entered. My mother was not there. She looked at Aptanides with a sweet but mournful expression on her face. "Tomorrow you are going to leave us," she said. "I am very sorry." "Sorry?" he exclaimed, and his voice was troubled with a grief as deep as my own. I could not speak, but he seized her hand and said, "Our brother yonder loves you, and is he not dear to you? His very silence now proves his affection." Anastasia trembled and burst into tears. Then I saw no one, thought of none but her. I threw my arms round her and pressed my lips to hers, as she flung her arms round my neck. The lamp fell to the ground, and we were in darkness, dark as the heart of poor Aptanides. Before daybreak he rose, kissed us all, and said farewell, and went away. He had given all his money to my mother for us. Anastasia was betrothed to me, and in a few days afterward she became my wife. End of The Shepherd's Story of the Bond of Friendship.
Section 26 of Hans Christian Andersen. Fairy Tales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ginger Kukalo. Hans Christian Andersen. Fairy Tales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.P. Paul. A Rose from Homer's Grave. All the songs of the East speak of the love of the nightingale for the rose in the silent starlight night. The winged songster serenades of fragrant flowers. Not far from Smyrna, where the merchant drives his loaded camels, proudly arching their long necks as they journey beneath the lofty pines over holy ground, I saw a hedge of roses. The turtle dove flew among the branches of the tall trees, and as the sunbeams fell upon her wings, they glistened as if they were mother of pearl. On the rose bush grew a flower, more beautiful than them all, and to her the nightingale sung of his woes. But the rose remained silent, not even a dewdrop lay like a tear of sympathy on her leaves. At last she bowed her head over a heap of stones, and said, "Here rests the greatest singer in the world. Over his tomb will I spread my fragrance, and on it I will let my leaves fall when the storm scatters them. He who sung of Troy became earth, and from that earth I have sprung. I, a rose from the grave of Homer, am too lofty to bloom for a nightingale." Then the nightingale sung himself to death. A camel driver came by, with his loaded camels and his black slaves. His little son found the dead bird, and buried the lovely songster in the grave of the great Homer, while the rose trembled in the wind. The evening came, and the rose wrapped her leaves more closely round her, and dreamed, and this was her dream. It was a fair, sunshiny day. A crowd of strangers drew near who had undertaken a pilgrimage to the grave of Homer. Among the strangers was a minstrel from the north, the home of the clouds and the brilliant lights of the aurora borealis. He plucked the rose and placed it in a book, and carried it away into a distant part of the world, his fatherland. The rose faded with grief, and lay between the leaves of the book, which he opened in his own home, saying, "Here is a rose from the grave of Homer." Then the flower awoke from her dream, and trembled in the wind. A drop of dew fell from the leaves upon the singer's grave. The sun rose, and the flower bloomed, more beautiful than ever. The day was hot, and she was still in her own warm Asia. Then footsteps approached. Strangers, such as a rose had seen in her dream, came by, and among them was a poet from the north. He plucked the rose, pressed a kiss upon her fresh mouth, and carried her away to the home of the clouds and the northern lights. Like a mummy, the flower now rests in his Iliad, and, as in her dream, she hears him say, as he opens the book, "Here is a rose from the grave of Homer." End of A Rose from Homer's Grave. Recording by Ginger Kukalo. Section 27 of Hans Christian Andersen. Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ginger Kukalo. Hans Christian Andersen. Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. 1835 to 1842 by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.P. Paul. The buckwheat. Very often, after a violent thunderstorm, a field of buckwheat appears blackened and singed, as if a flame of fire had passed over it. The country people say that this appearance is caused by lightning. But I will tell you what the sparrow says, and the sparrow heard it from an old willow tree which grew near a field of buckwheat, and is there still. It is a large, venerable tree, though a little crippled by age. The trunk has been split, and out of the crevice grass and brambles grow. The tree bends forward slightly, and the branches hang quite down to the ground, just like green hair. Corn grows in the surrounding fields, not only rye and barley, but oats, pretty oats that, when ripe, look like a number of little golden canary birds sitting on a bough. The corn has a smiling look, and the heaviest and richest ears bend their heads low as if in pious humility. Once there was also a field of buckwheat, and this field was exactly opposite to old willow tree. The buckwheat did not bend like the other grain, but erected its head proudly and stiffly on the stem. "I am as valuable as any other corn," said he, "and I am much handsomer. My flowers are as beautiful as the bloom of the apple blossom, and it is a pleasure to look at us. Do you know of anything prettier than we are, you old willow tree?" And the willow tree nodded his head, as if he would say, "Indeed I do." But the buckwheat spread itself out with pride, and said, "Stupid tree! He is so old that grass grows out of his body." There arose a very terrible storm. All the field flowers folded their leaves together, or bowed their little heads, while the storm passed over them, but the buckwheat stood erect in its pride. "Bend your heads as we do," said the flowers. "I have no occasion to do so," replied the buckwheat. "Bend your head as we do," cried the ears of corn. "The angel of the storm is coming. His wings spread from the sky above to the earth beneath. He will strike you down before you can cry for mercy." "But I will not bend my head," said the buckwheat. "Close your flowers and bend your leaves," said the old willow tree. "Do not look at the lightning when the cloud bursts. Even men cannot do that. In a flash of lightning heaven opens, and we can look in, but the sight will strike even human beings blind. What then must happen to us who only grow out of the earth, and are so inferior to them if we venture to do so?" "Inferior, indeed," said the buckwheat. "Now I intend to have a peep into heaven." Proudly and boldly he looked up, while the lightning flashed across the sky as if the whole world were in flames. When the dreadful storm had passed, the flowers and the corn raised their drooping heads in the pure, still air, refreshed by the rain. But the buckwheat lay like a weed in the field, burnt to blackness by the lightning. The branches of the old willow tree rustled in the wind, and large water drops fell from his green leaves as if the old willow were weeping. Then the sparrows asked why he was weeping, when all around him seemed so cheerful. "See," they said, "how the sun shines and the clouds float in the blue sky. Do you not smell the sweet perfume from flower and bush? Wherefore do you weep, old willow tree?" Then the willow told them of the haughty pride of the buckwheat, and of the punishment which followed in consequence. This is the story told to me by the sparrows one evening when I begged them to relate some tale to me. End of The Buckwheat, recording by Ginger Kukalo.
Section 28 of Hans Christian Andersen's Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine G. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H. P. Paul. Ole Lukkøye, the Dream God. There is nobody in the world who knows so many stories as Ole Lukkøye, or who can relate them so nice. In the evening, while the children are seated at the table, or in their little chairs, he comes up the stairs very softly, for he walks in his socks. Then he opens the doors without the slightest noise, and throws a small quantity of very fine dust in their eyes, just enough to prevent them from keeping them open, and so they do not see him. Then he creeps behind them, and blows softly upon their necks, till their heads begin to droop. But Ole Lukkøye does not wish to hurt them, for he is very fond of children, and only wants them to be quiet that he may relate to them pretty stories, and they never are quiet until they are in bed and asleep. As soon as they are asleep, Ole Lukkøye seats himself upon the bed. He is nicely dressed. His coat is made of silken stuff. It is impossible to say of what color, for it changes from green to red, and from red to blue, as he turns from side to side. Under each arm he carries an umbrella, one of them, with pictures on the inside, he spreads over the good children, and then they dream the most beautiful stories the whole night. But the other umbrella has no pictures, and this he holds over the naughty children, so that they sleep heavily, and wake in the morning without having dreamed at all. Now we shall hear how Ole Lukkøye came every night during a whole week to the little boy named Hjalmar, and what he told him. There were 7 stories, and there are 7 days in the week. Monday. Now pay attention, said Ole Lukkøye in the evening, when Hjalmar was in bed, and I will decorate the room. Immediately all the flowers in the flower pots became large trees, with long branches reaching to the ceiling, and stretching along the walls, so that the whole room was like a greenhouse. All the branches were loaded with flowers, each flower as beautiful and as fragrant as a rose, and, Had any one tasted them, he would have found them sweeter even than jam. The fruit glittered like gold, and there were cakes so full of plums that they were nearly bursting. It was incomparably beautiful. At the same time sounded dismal moans from the table drawer in which lay Hjalmar's school books. "What can that be now?" said Ole Lukøye, going to the table and pulling out a drawer. It was a slate, in such distress because of a false number in the sum, that it had almost broken itself to pieces. The pencil pulled and tugged at its string as if it were a little dog that wanted to help but could not. And then came a moan from Hjalmar's copybook. Oh, it was quite terrible to hear. On each leaf stood a row of capital letters, every one having a small letter by its side. This formed the copy. Under these were other letters, which Hjalmar had written. They fancied they looked like the copy, but they were mistaken, for they were leaning on one side, as if they intended to fall over the pencil lines. "See, this is the way you should hold yourself," said the copy. "Look here, you should slope thus, with a graceful curve." "Oh, we are very willing to do so, but we cannot," said Hjalmar's letters. "We are so wretchedly made." "He must be scratched out then," said Ole Lukøye. "Oh no," they cried, and then they stood up so gracefully it was quite a pleasure to look at them. "Now we must give up our stories and exercise these letters," said Ole Lukøye. 1, 2, 1, 2. So he drilled them till they stood up gracefully and looked as beautiful as copy could look. But after Ole Lukøye was gone, and Hjalmar looked at them in the morning, they were as wretched and awkward as ever. Tuesday. As soon as Hjalmar was in bed, Ole Lukøye touched, with his little magic wand, all the furniture in the room, which immediately began to chatter, and each article only talked of itself. Over the chest of drawers hung a large picture in a gilt frame, representing a landscape, with fine old trees, flowers in the grass, and a broad stream which flowed through the wood, past several castles, far out into the wild ocean. Ole Lukøye touched the picture with his magic wand, and immediately the birds commenced singing, the branches of the trees rustled, and the clouds moved across the sky, casting their shadows on the landscape beneath them. Then Ole Lukøye lifted little Hjalmar up to the frame, and placed his feet in the picture, just on the high grass, and there he stood with the sun shining down upon him through the branches of the trees. He ran to the water, and seated himself in a little boat which lay there, and which was painted red and white. The sails glittered like silver, and 6 swans, each with a golden circlet round its neck, and a bright blue star on its forehead, drew the boat past the green wood, where the trees talked of robbers and witches, and the flowers of beautiful little elves and fairies, whose history the butterflies had related to them. Brilliant fish with scales like silver and gold swam after the boat, sometimes making a spring and splashing the water round them, while birds, red and blue, small and great, flew after him in 2 long lines. The gnats danced around them, and the cockchafers cried, "Buzz, buzz." They all wanted to follow Hjalmar, and all had some story to tell him. It was a most pleasant sail. Sometimes the forests were thick and dark, sometimes like a beautiful garden, gay with sunshine and flowers. Then he passed great palaces of glass and marble, and on the balconies stood princesses, whose faces were those of little girls whom Hjalmar knew well, and had often played with. One of them held out her hand, in which was a heart made of sugar, more beautiful than any confectioner ever sold. As Hjalmar sailed on, he caught hold of one side of the sugar heart, and held it fast, and the princess held fast also, so that it broke into 2 pieces. Hjalmar had one piece, and the princess the other, but Hjalmar's was the largest. At each castle stood little princes acting as sentinels. They presented arms, and had golden swords, and made it rain plums and tin soldiers, so that they must have been real princes. Hjalmar continued to sail, sometimes through woods, sometimes as it were through large halls, and then by large cities. At last he came to the town where his nurse lived, who had carried him in her arms when he was a very little boy, and had always been kind to him. She nodded and beckoned to him, and then sang the little verses she had herself composed, and said to him: "How oft my memory turns to thee, my own Hjalmar ever dear, when I could watch thy infant glee, or kiss away her pearly tear. 'Twas in my arms thy lisping tongue first spoke the half-remembered word, while over thy tottering steps I hung, my fond protection to afford. Farewell, I pray the heavenly power to keep thee till thy dying hour." And all the birds sang the same tune, the flowers danced on the stems, and the old trees nodded, as if Ole Lukøya had been telling them stories as well. Wednesday. How the rain did pour down! Hjalmar could hear it in his sleep, and when Ole Lukøya opened the window, the water flowed quite up to the window sill. It had the appearance of the large lake outside, and a beautiful ship lay close to the house. "Wilt thou sail with me tonight, little Hjalmar?" said Ole Lukøya. "Then we shall see foreign countries, and thou shalt return here in the morning." All in a moment there stood Hjalmar, in his best clothes, on the deck of the noble ship, and immediately the weather became fine. They sailed through the streets, round by the church, and on every side rolled the wide great sea. They sailed till the land disappeared, and then they saw a flock of storks, who had left their own country, and were travelling to warmer climates. The storks flew one behind the other, and had already been a long, long time on the wing. One of them seemed so tired that his wings could scarcely carry him. He was the last of the row, and was soon left very far behind. At length he sunk lower and lower, with outstretched wings, flapping them in vain, till his feet touched the rigging of the ship, and he slided from the sails to the deck, and stood before them. Then a sailor boy caught him, and put him in the hen house, with the fowls, the ducks, and the turkeys, while the poor stork stood quite bewildered amongst them. "Just look at that fellow," said the chickens. Then the turkey cock puffed himself out as large as he could, and inquired who he was, and the ducks waddled backwards, crying "Quack, quack." Then the stork told them all about warm Africa, of the pyramids, and of the ostrich, which, like a wild horse, runs across the desert. But the ducks did not understand what he said, and quacked among themselves. "We are all of the same opinion, namely, that he is stupid." "Yes, to be sure, he is stupid," said the turkey cock, and gobbled. Then the stork remained quite silent, and thought of his home in Africa. "Those are handsome thin legs of yours," said the turkey cock. "What do they cost a yard?" "Quack, quack, quack," grinned the ducks, but the stork pretended not to hear. "You may as well laugh," said the turkey, "for that remain was rather witty, or perhaps he was above you. Aha, is he not clever? He will be a great amusement to us while he remains here." And then he gobbled, and the ducks quacked, "Gobble, gobble, quack, quack." What a terrible uproar they made, while they were having such fun among themselves. Then Hjalmar went to the hen house, and, opening the door, called to the stork. Then he hopped out on the deck. He had rested himself now, and he looked happy, and seemed as if he nodded to Hjalmar, as if to thank him. Then he spread his wings, and flew away to warmer countries, while the hens clucked, the ducks quacked, and the turkey cock turned quite scarlet in the head. "Tomorrow you shall be made into soup," said Hjalmar to the fowls, and then he awoke and found himself lying on his little bed. It was a wonderful journey with Ole Lukøya that made him take this night. Thursday. "What do you think I have got here?" said Ole Lukøya. "Do not be frightened, and you shall see a little mouse." And then he held out his hand to him, in which lay a lovely little creature. "It has come to invite you to a wedding. 2 little mice are going to enter into the marriage state tonight. They reside under the floor of your mother's storeroom, and that must be a fine dwelling place." "But how can I get through the little mouse hole in the floor?" asked Hjalmar. "Leave me to manage that," said Ole Lukøya. "I will soon make you small enough." And then he touched Hjalmar with his magic wand, whereupon he became less and less, until at last he was not longer than a little finger. Now you can borrow the dress of the tin soldier. I think it will just fit you. It looks well to wear a uniform when you go into company." "Yes, certainly," said Hjalmar, and in a moment he was dressed as neatly as the neatest of all tin soldiers. "Will you be so good as to seat yourself in your mamma's thimble," said the little mouse, "that I may have the pleasure of drawing you to the wedding?" "Will you really take so much trouble, young lady?" said Hjalmar, and so in this way he rode to the mouse's wedding. First they went under the floor, and then passed through a long passage, which was scarcely high enough to allow the thimble to drive under, and the whole passage was lit up with the phosphorescent light of rotten wood. "Does it not smell delicious?" asked the mouse, as she drew him along. "The wall and the floor have been smeared with bacon rind. Nothing can be nicer." Very soon they arrived at the bridal hall. On the right stood all the little lady mice, whispering and giggling as if they were making game of each other. To the left were the gentlemen mice, stroking their whiskers with their forepaws, and in the center of the hall could be seen the bridal pair, standing side by side, in a hollow cheese rind, and kissing each other, while all eyes were upon them, for they had already been betrothed, and were soon to be married. More and more friends kept arriving, till the mice were nearly treading each other to death, for the bridal pair now stood in the doorway, and none could pass in or out. The room had been rubbed over with bacon rind, like the passage, which was all the refreshment offered to the guests, but for dessert they produced a pea, on which a mouse belonging to the bridal pair had bitten the first letters of their names. This was something quite uncommon. All the mice said it was a very beautiful wedding, and that they had been very agreeably entertained. After this, Hjalmar returned home. He had certainly been in grand society, but he had been obliged to creep under a room, and to make himself small enough to wear the uniform of a tin soldier. Friday. "It is incredible how many old people there are who would be glad to have me at night," said Ole Lukøye. "Especially those who have done something wrong. 'Good little Ole,' say they to me, 'we cannot close our eyes, and we lie awake the whole night, and see all our evil deeds, sitting on our beds like little imps, and sprinkling us with hot water. Will you come and drive them away, that we may have a good night's rest?' And then they sigh so deeply and say, 'We would gladly pay you for it. Good night, Ole Luk. The money lies on the window.' But I never do anything for gold." "What shall we do tonight?" asked Hjalmar. "I do not know whether you would care to go to another wedding," he replied, "although it is quite a different affair to the one we saw last night. Your sister's large doll, that is dressed like a man, and is called Herman. It is also the doll's birthday, and they will receive many presents." "Yes, I know that already," said Hjalmar. "My sister always allows her dolls to keep their birthdays or to have a wedding when they require new clothes. That has happened already 100 times, I am quite sure." "Yes, so it may, but tonight is the 101st wedding, and when that has taken place it must be the last, therefore this is to be extremely beautiful. Only look." Hjalmar looked at the table, and there stood a little cardboard doll's house, with lights in all the windows, and drawn up before it were the tin soldiers, presenting arms. The bridal pair was seated on the floor, leaning against the leg of the table, looking very thoughtful, and with good reason. Then Ole Lukøye, dressed up in grandmother's black gown, married them. As soon as the ceremony was concluded, all the furniture in the room joined in singing a beautiful song, which had been composed by the lead pencil, and which went to the melody of a military tattoo. "What merry sounds are on the wind, as marriage rites together bind, a quiet and a loving pair, though formed of kid, yet smooth and fair. Hurrah, if they are deaf and blind, we'll sing the word approve and kind." And now came the present, but the bridal pair had nothing to eat, for love was to be their food. "Shall we go to a country house or travel?" asked the bridegroom. Then they consulted the swallow, who had travelled so far, and the old hen in the yard, who had brought up fine broods of chickens. And the swallow talked to them of warm countries where the grapes hang in large clusters on the vines, and the air is soft and mild, and about the mountains glowing with colors more beautiful than we can think of. "But they have no red cabbage like we have," said the hen. I was once in the country with my chickens for a whole summer. There was a large sandpit in which we could walk about and scratch as we liked. Then we got into a garden in which grew red cabbage. Oh, how nice it was! I cannot think of anything more delicious." "But one cabbage stalk is exactly like another," said the Swallow, "and here we have often bad weather." "Yes, but we are accustomed to it," said the Hen. "But it is so cold here, and freezes sometimes." "Cold weather is good for cabbages," said the Hen. "Besides, we do have it warm here sometimes. 4 years ago we had a summer that lasted more than 5 weeks, and it was so hot one could scarcely breathe. And then in this country we have no poisonous animals, and we are free from robbers. He must be wicked who does not consider our country the finest of all lands. He ought not to be allowed to live here." And then the Hen wept very much and said, "I have also travelled. I once went 12 miles in a coop, and it was not pleasant travelling at all." "The Hen is a sensible woman," said the doll Bertha. "I don't care for travelling over mountains, just to go up and come down again. No, let us go to the sandpit in front of the gate, and then take a walk in the cabbage garden." And so they settled in. Saturday. "Am I to hear more stories?" asked little Hjalmar, as soon as Ole Lukoie had sent him to sleep. "We shall have no time this evening," said he, spreading out his prettiest umbrella over the child. "Look at these Chinese." And then the whole umbrella appeared, like a large china bowl, with blue trees and pointed bridges, upon which stood the little Chinamen nodding their heads. "We must make all the world beautiful for tomorrow morning," said Ole Lukoie, "for it will be a holiday. It is Sunday. I must now go to the church steeple and see if the little sprites who live there have polished the bells, so that they may sound sweetly. Then I must go into the fields and see if the wind has blown the dust from the grass and the leaves. And the most difficult task of all which I have to do is to take down all the stars and brighten them up. I have to number them first before I put them in my apron, and also to number the places from which I take them, so that they may go back into the right holes, or else they would not remain, and we should have a number of falling stars, for they will all tumble down one after the other." "Hark ye, Mr. Lukoie," said an old portrait which hung on the wall of Hjalmar's bedroom. "Do you know me? I am Hjalmar's great-grandfather. I thank you for telling the boy stories, but you must not confuse his ideas. The stars cannot be taken down from the sky and polished. They are spheres like our earth, which is a good thing for them." "Thank you, old great-grandfather," said Ole Lukoie. "I thank you. You may be the head of the family, as no doubt you are, but I am older than you. I am an ancient heathen. The old Romans and Greeks named me the dream god. I have visited the noblest houses, and continue to do so. Still, I know how to conduct myself, both to high and low, and now you may tell the stories yourself." And so Ole Lukoie walked off, taking his umbrella with him. "Well, well, one is never to give an opinion, I suppose," grumbled the portrait, and it woke Hjalmar. Sunday. "Good evening," said Ole Lukoie. Hjalmar nodded, and then sprang out of bed, and turned his great-grandfather's portrait to the wall, so that it might not interrupt them as it had done yesterday. "Now," said he, "you must tell me some stories about 5 green peas that lived in one pod, or of the chickweed that courted the chickweed, or of the darning needle who acted so proudly because she fancied herself an embroidery needle." "You may have too much of a good thing," said Ole Lukoie. "You know that I like best to show you something, so I will show you my brother. He is also called Ole Lukoie, but he never visits anyone but once, and when he does come, he takes him away on his horse, and tells him stories as they ride along. He knows only 2 stories. One of these is so wonderfully beautiful, and no one in the world can imagine anything at all like it, but the other is just as ugly and frightful, so that it would be impossible to describe it." Then Ole Lukoie lifted Hjalmar up to the window. "There now, you can see my brother, the other Ole Lukoie. He is also called Death. You perceive he is not so bad as they represent him in picture books. There he is a skeleton, but now his coat is embroidered with silver, and he wears the splendid uniform of a hussar, and a mantle of black velvet flies behind him over the horse. Look how he gallops along. Hjalmar saw that as this Ole Lukøye rode on, he lifted up old and young and carried them away on his horse. Some he seated in front of him and some behind, but always enquired first, "How stands the mark book?" "Good," they all answered. "Yes, but let me see for myself," he replied, and they were obliged to give him the books. Then all those who had very good or exceedingly good came in front of the horse, and heard the beautiful story, while those who had middling or tolerably good in their books were obliged to sit behind and listen to the frightful tale. They trembled and cried, and wanted to jump from the horse, but they could not get free, for they seemed fastened to the seat. "Why, Death is a most splendid Lukøye," said Hjalmar. "I am not in the least afraid of him." "You need have no fear of him," said Ole Lukøye, "if you take care and keep a good conduct book." "Now I call that very instructive, mem the great-grandfather's portrait. It is useful sometime to express an opinion." So he was quite satisfied. These are some of the doings and sayings of Ole Lukøye. I hope he may visit you himself this evening, and relate some more. End of Section 28. Ole Lukøye, the Dream God. Recording by Christine G. in Oslo, Norway. The 15th of January 2012.
Section 29 of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eve Lynn. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.P. Paul. The Swineherd. Once upon a time lived a poor prince. His kingdom was very small, but it was large enough to enable him to marry, and marry he would. It was rather bold of him that he went and asked the emperor's daughter, "Will you marry me?" But he ventured to do so, for his name was known far and wide, and there were hundreds of princesses who would have gladly accepted him. But would she do so? Now we shall see. On the grave of the prince's father grew a rose tree, the most beautiful of its kind. It bloomed only once in 5 years, and then it had only one single rose upon it, but what a rose! It has such a sweet scent that one instantly forgot all sorrow and grief when one smelt it. He had also a nightingale, which could sing as if every sweet melody was in its throat. This rose and the nightingale he wished to give to the princess, and therefore both were put into big silver cases and sent to her. The emperor ordered them to be carried into the great hall, where the princess was just playing "Visitors are coming," with her ladies in waiting. When she saw the large cases with the presents therein, she clapped her hands for joy. "I wish it were a little pussy cat," she said. But then the rose tree with the beautiful rose was unpacked. "Oh, how nicely it is made!" exclaimed the ladies. "It is more than nice," said the emperor. "It is charming." The princess touched it and nearly began to cry. "For shame, Pa," she said. "It is not artificial, it is natural." "For shame, it is natural," repeated all her ladies. "Let us first see what the other case contains before we are angry," said the emperor. Then the nightingale was taken out, and it sang so beautifully that no one could possibly say anything unkind about it. "Superbe! Charmant!" said the ladies of the court, for they all prattled French, one worse than the other. "How much the bird reminds me of the musical box of the late lamented Empress," said an old courtier. "It has exactly the same tone, the same execution." "You are right," said the emperor, and began to cry like a little child. "I hope it is not natural," said the princess. "Yes, certainly it is natural," replied those who had brought the presents. "Then let it fly," said the princess, and refused to see the prince. But the prince was not discouraged. He painted his face, put on common clothes, pulled his cap over his forehead, and came back. "Good day, Emperor," he said. "Could you not give me some employment at the court?" "There are so many," replied the emperor, "who apply for places, that for the present I have no vacancy. But I will remember you. But wait a moment. It just comes into my mind. I require somebody to look after my pigs, for I have a great many." Thus the prince was appointed imperial swineherd, and as such he lived in a wretchedly small room near the pigsty. There he worked all day long, and when it was night he had made a pretty little pot. There were little bells round the room, and when the water began to boil in it, the bells began to play the old tune. A jolly old sow once lived in a sty, 3 little piggies had she. But what was more wonderful was that, when one put a finger into the steam rising from the pot, one could at once smell what meals they were preparing on every fire in the whole town. That was indeed much more remarkable than the rose. When the princess with her ladies passed by and heard the tune, she stopped and looked quite pleased, for she also could play it. In fact, it was the only tune she could play, and she played it with one finger. "That is the tune I know," she exclaimed. "He must be a well-educated swineherd. Go and ask him how much the instrument is." One of the ladies had to go and ask, but she put on patens. "What will you take for your pot?" asked the lady. "I will have 10 kisses from the princess," said the swineherd. "God forbid!" said the lady. "Well, I cannot sell it for less," replied the swineherd. "What did he say?" said the princess. "I really cannot tell you," replied the lady. "You can whisper it into my ear." "It is very naughty," said the princess, and walked off. But when she had gone a little distance, the bells rang again so sweetly. A jolly old sow once lived in a sty, 3 little piggies had she. "Ask him," said the princess, "if he will be satisfied with 10 kisses from one of my ladies." "No, thank you," said the swineherd. 10 kisses from the princess, or I keep my pot." "That is tiresome," said the princess, "but you must stand before me so that nobody can see it." The ladies placed themselves in front of her and spread out their dresses, and she gave the swineherd 10 kisses and received the pot. That was a pleasure. Day and night the water in the pot was boiling. There was not a single fire in the whole town of which they did not know what was preparing on it, the chamberlains as well as the shoemakers. The ladies danced and clapped their hands for joy. "We know who will eat soup and pancakes. We know who will eat porridge and cutlets. Oh, how interesting!" "Very interesting indeed," said the mistress of the household. "But you must not betray me, for I am the emperor's daughter." "Of course not," they all said. The swineherd, that is to say, the prince, but they did not know otherwise than that he was a real swineherd, did not waste a single day without doing something. He made a rattle, which when turned quickly round, played all the waltzes, galops, and polkas known since the creation of the world. "But that is superbe!" said the princess passing by. "I have never heard a more beautiful composition. Go down and ask him what the instrument costs, but I shall not kiss him again." "He will have 100 kisses from the princess," said the lady who had gone down to ask him. "I believe he is mad," said the princess, and walked off. But soon she stopped. "One must encourage art," she said. "I am the emperor's daughter. Tell him I will give him 10 kisses, as I did the other day. The remainder one of my ladies can give him." "But we do not like to kiss him," said the ladies. "That is nonsense," said the princess. "If I can kiss him, you can also do it. Remember that I give you food and employment." And the lady had to go down once more. 100 kisses from the princess," said the swineherd, "or everybody keeps his own." "Place yourselves before me," said the princess then. They did as they were bidden, and the princess kissed him. "I wonder what the crowd near the pigsty means," said the emperor, who had just come out on his balcony. He rubbed his eyes and put his spectacles on. "The ladies of the court are up to some mischief, I think. I shall have to go down and see." He pulled up his shoes, for they were down at his heels, and he was very quick about it. When he had come down into the courtyard, he walked quite softly, and the ladies were so busily engaged in counting the kisses, that all should be fair, that they did not notice the emperor. He raised himself on tiptoe. "What does this mean?" he said, when he saw that his daughter was kissing the swineherd, and then hit their heads with his shoe, just as the swineherd received the 68th kiss. "Go out of my sight," said the emperor, for he was very angry, and both the princess and the swineherd were banished from the empire. There she stood and cried, the swineherd scolded her, and the rain came down in torrents. "Alas, unfortunate creature I am," said the princess. "I wish I had accepted the prince. Oh, how wretched I am!" The swineherd went behind a tree, wiped his face, threw off his poor attire, and stepped forth in his princely garments. He looked so beautiful that the princess could not help bowing to him. "I have now learned to despise you," he said. "You refused an honest prince. You did not appreciate the rose and the nightingale, but you did not mind kissing a swineherd for his toys. You have no one but yourself to blame." And then he returned to his kingdom and left her behind. She could now sing at her leisure. "A jolly old sow once lived in a sty, 3 little piggies has she." End of The Swineherd. Recording by Eve Lynn. End of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairy Tales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H. P. Paul.